Okay, we'll make a start now. So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's nice to see so many of you dialed in. This is the next instalment of our Future HR Leaders Club. We've run a couple of these clubs in the past, and I can see a few familiar faces dialed in. So thank you for joining us again, and I can see a couple of new faces as well. So it's lovely to see you all. We're going to be talking today about coronavirus and returning to work. I think it'd be a bit remiss of us not to cover that topic, because it's obviously a hot topic for most HR professionals at the moment. Those of you that have been to our sessions before will know that we like to try and make these sessions as interactive as possible. It's a little more difficult than usual in webinar form to do that, but if you do want to ask a question, or if you do want to say anything or contribute at all, then please feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat feature that should be at the side of your screen. We will, answer any questions, any comments or anything. We will pick up on those. So please do make use of those features. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Emily Weston, and I'm a solicitor in the employment team at Irwin Mitchell, and I'm joined today by my colleague Laura Moss, who is a trainee solicitor in our team. We're running this webinar today in conjunction with Page Personnel, so thank you very much to Page Personnel for assisting us. And without further ado, we'll get started. So one of the things that we wanted to sort of pick up and perhaps have a little interactivity around is what the main HR challenges have been for you in dealing with the implications of COVID-19. I think some of those are perhaps obvious, some probably less so, but we're just interested in the practical experiences that you've had and what it is that's really been the key issues for you over the past couple of months. So if you do have any, anything you want to say, or as I said, any questions or anything like that, then just pop them in the chat feature, or feel free to unmute yourself. The common themes that we've certainly been seeing over the past couple of months are towards the start of lockdown, issues around staff being afraid or reluctant to come into work, making sure that the workplace is a safe environment for staff to come into whilst they were still working and actually attending the workplace, and what measures could be put in place to help to mitigate against those concerns, how to mitigate those concerns in particular for those staff that are in the very vulnerable and high risk groups, and whether to, obviously before the furlough scheme started, whether to allow them to stay at home, and how, what that should look like in terms of HR practices and pay. And then obviously as we've moved into lockdown, the furlough scheme was announced, so there have been significant challenges in understanding the furlough scheme, and making sure that you are following the guidelines and following everything that's been announced by the government in respect of the furlough scheme, and then obviously advising stakeholders within the business in respect of what the guidance is, what the rules are, what it's possible to claim and what it's not possible to claim, and what the different options are within the business to manage the situation. And then I think as we've moved through the furlough period, managing people that are on furlough and making sure that they are okay from a wellbeing perspective. If you've got people that have been not on furlough but working from home, again, making sure that they are okay, that they have the equipment and what they need to actually carry out their roles, and then monitoring the work that they're doing, and making sure that everybody's happy and comfortable with working from home. And then obviously for those of you that are in sectors where you have been able to carry on working, perhaps those that have got key workers within their business, for example, making sure that they are okay, because obviously it's been a stressful time for those people that have been able to keep working. So I think there have been some significant challenges, and one that we wanted to talk about in particular is the furlough scheme, and obviously the challenges that we've already experienced with that scheme, but also the challenges with the new scheme, so the flexible furlough scheme that's been announced recently. So I'm going to start the session by talking about that in a little bit more detail. And then Laura is going to come on to consider returning to work, what we need to be thinking about when bringing staff back into the workplace, and then what we need to be thinking about in terms of people that are particularly vulnerable, perhaps those that have been in the shielding category, and just what we need to think about generally in terms of making workplaces what we call COVID secure. So in respect of the furlough scheme, obviously the scheme was announced and started back in March, and I think many employers have used the scheme. It's due to continue until the 31st of October, although there is going to be a sort of a sliding scale of what you can actually claim under that scheme from the period until basically now until the end of the scheme. I've just put on the slide here, obviously the scheme's been a bit of a lifeline, I think, for many businesses during this period, as I know there were some very difficult conversations that were taking place prior to the scheme being announced around how businesses were going to cope. A lot of businesses were considering redundancies and other cost-saving measures prior to the scheme being announced. So obviously it has been an absolute lifeline. I think it came a little bit too late for some employers, particularly those, as I said, that were considering redundancies and cost-saving measures. But I think most employers have been able to claim from the scheme retrospectively, which has obviously been helpful. But the scheme hasn't come, or certainly hasn't come without its difficulties, and I think many employers have found the scheme to be more complicated than they'd expected it to be. The rules and the guidance that have been released by HMRC and the government have been complicated and at times vague and unclear. So we've had difficulties in particular around what is and isn't included within furlough pay and what you can actually claim the grant in respect of. The position regarding annual leave was very uncertain for a long period of time, as we didn't know whether it was possible for annual leave to be taken during furlough, and what people should be paid if they were on annual leave. So there are a lot of questions around that. And the same with sick leave, and the same with notice. So could you give somebody notice whilst they're on furlough or not? And then the other point I've just put on the slide is this point around carrying out employment processes during furlough, because there was this general rule that people were not allowed to carry out any work for their employer during the initial furlough period. And there's a question around whether that included attending redundancy consultations, or if there was some other employment process that it was ongoing before the scheme was announced. Was it possible to actually continue with that process? We've seen answers to quite a few of those questions now, so we're a lot clearer, I think, now in terms of what isn't included within furlough pay and what you can actually claim from the scheme. There's some quite detailed guidance now available via the government website and HMRC guidance that goes into lots of detail about what you can and can't claim. And there's also quite a lot of worked examples within the guidance that are really helpful, particularly as we move into this period of what we're calling flexible furlough, which I'll come on to talk about in further detail shortly. The annual leave position has been clarified, so we now know that it is possible to take annual leave during furlough. and that pay during that period should be topped up to normal pay. We know that people can be given notice whilst they're on furlough now, and we also know that they can also participate in things like redundancy consultation processes. So we have had some clarity around some of those issues, but it's these interim periods where a lot of employers were having to make decisions without really knowing the full facts, and that's obviously a very difficult position. And the guidance itself has been updated multiple times, and the government have sort of moved the goalposts quite a few times in relation to some of those issues that I've just spoken about. And then we've also had inconsistent guidance. So there is a Treasury direction. So the government have issued a Treasury direction to HMRC to instruct them as to how the furlough scheme should operate. And at times there has been some inconsistencies between that Treasury direction and the guidance that was actually issued by HMRC for employers and employees. So that's obviously also caused a lot of uncertainty and questions around what the rules of the scheme are. I think the final thing to say is that the new guidance in respect of the flexible furlough period, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is also incredibly complicated. It's very complicated to actually calculate what can be claimed for that period, because obviously it's more tricky now that workers are able to come back and work on a part-time basis, as you're only claiming the furlough grant for that part of their working week where they're not actually they're not actually working. Sorry, so that makes it a lot more complicated to carry out the furlough calculations. So. Sorry, I'm just taking the slides off there. Hopefully you can see those again. So I just wanted to ask, really, because obviously we have been involved in advising employers in respect of the scheme and the legal implications of the scheme. So what I wanted to ask, and what I thought it might be interesting to ask, was what are your experiences of using the scheme? How have you found the claims process? How have you found implementing the scheme generally? Have you had any issues that have cropped up with employees that have that you've either asked to take a period of furlough leave, or that have been on furlough? And do you have any comments that might be helpful for the group in terms of the practicalities of actually using the scheme? If you do have anything that you want to add, as I said before, if you just either unmute yourself and just let us know, or pop your comments into the chat section, and we'll pick up on those either as we go through or at the end of the session. I think it'd just be, like I said, interesting to share those practical experiences. So, as I said, I'm going to come on to talk about the flexible furlough scheme and the new guidance on the scheme. So we've put together a bit of a table on the next slide, which just sets out what you can actually claim and when. This is the table that appears on the government website. So it's just setting out what you can claim for the different months of the year. And it's an example of where the employee is actually furloughed 100% of the time, but obviously you can now bring employees back on a part-time basis and flexibly furlough them, as we're calling it. So you've got there on the slide that from the 1st of July you can bring employees back to work for any amount of time and any shift pattern, while still being able to claim the furlough grant for the hours that aren't worked. So that is essentially the scheme for July. From the 1st of August, the level of the grant will be reduced from each month. So to be eligible, the employer must pay furloughed employees 80% of their wages up to that cap of £2,500, which is remaining the same in August. as it has been previously, for any time that they are actually furloughed. And that's the key point really with the flexible furlough scheme, is that you claim the furlough grant for the period of time when they are furloughed, and then the employee is paid in as normal effectively for any time that they are working on a part-time basis during that period. From September, the government will pay 70% of wages up to the cap of £2,187.50 for the hours, again, that the employee is on furlough. And they will pay employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions, and top up employees' wages to ensure that they receive 80% of their wages. So the amount that the government will pay is the 70%, and then the employer has to top up the wages and the national insurance contributions and pension contributions, because they will no longer be covered by the scheme in September. So that's the change in September, and then in October the government contribution goes down to 60%, up to the overall cap of 1,875, and then again the employer effectively would need to top up to the 80% wages and contribute towards the national insurance contributions and the pension contributions. So that's the scheme going forwards in a bit of a nutshell. Essentially, the employee will always get, as you can see from the bottom row there, 80% of their wages up to £2,500 per month. But the change is that the employer has to contribute part of that, rather than it being claimed in its entirety from the government and the furlough scheme. In terms of flexible furlough, so only employees that have been furloughed for at least 3 weeks on or before the 30th of June under the old scheme, and what we mean by the old scheme is the scheme prior to the 1st of July, can be furloughed after the 1st of July. So if your employee hasn't been furloughed for a 3-week period by the 30th of June, you won't be able to then make a furlough claim for them going forwards. There are a couple of exceptions to that, where you've got parents that are returning to work from some kind of family-related leave, so maternity leave, shared parental leave, adoption leave, paternity leave, and parental bereavement leave. So it is still possible to furlough people in those categories, even if they've not been furloughed for 3 weeks before the 30th of June. From the 1st of July, you'll be able to bring back previously furloughed employees for any amount of time and on any pattern of work. So previously you had to furlough employees for this 3-week period in order for them to be eligible for the grant. But there's no longer that limit on what amount of time they need to be furloughed for. So you can bring them back for any amount of, put them on furlough, sorry, for any amount of time. And you can also, as I said before, ask them to work on a part-time basis if you wish to do so. And as I said, you would claim the grant for the hours that they're not actually working at that time. So as an example, if your employee works 5 days a week and you only need them to come back into work for 2, you would then furlough them for the remaining 3 days and then pay their normal salary for the 2 days that they are working. If business picks up, you could then change that arrangement, so you could bring them back in for another day, so you could have them in for 3 days and then furloughed for 2. Alternatively, if you don't need them to come back into work, or there's not enough work for them to do, you could keep them on full-time furlough as per the previous scheme, but you would need to contribute more to the cost of that from the 1st of July onwards, when the government has stopped paying or contributing towards the furlough grant. So it's just these changes on a sliding scale in terms of what the government will actually contribute towards the cost of furlough. As I said before, it is extremely complicated to actually calculate what you can claim in respect of the grant when people are flexibly furloughed. And the rules are that after the 1st of July, you can't submit claims that actually cross calendar months. So it means so if you've got somebody on furlough, for example, for June and July, you'll need to submit separate claims for June and July under the scheme. Even if they've actually been furloughed continuously throughout that period, it needs to be on a monthly basis effectively. The number of employees that you can actually put on furlough after the 1st of July can't exceed the maximum number of employees that you claim for under the old scheme. So the point is, I suppose, that you can only furlough people that have been furloughed before, prior to the 30th of June. So you wouldn't then be able to have more people on furlough after the 1st of July than you had on furlough before the 30th of June. That may cause an issue for those employers that have furloughed people on rotation. So it was quite common under the old scheme for employees to be furloughed in 3-week periods and for them to then rotate. So one person would be at work and another person would be on furlough. Then after 3 weeks, they would effectively swap. That could create a difficulty in terms of claiming via the scheme from the 1st of July, as you can only claim for the number of employees that you had on furlough under the old scheme. The government guidance also advises in terms of record keeping and the actual written agreement that the flexible furlough arrangement needs to have a new written agreement to confirm the new furlough arrangement. So most employers will have entered into furlough agreements with their staff when they were furloughed under the scheme prior to the 30th of June. And what the government is saying in relation to flexible furlough is that you need to update that and have a new written agreement in place to record the flexible furlough arrangements. And that agreement must be kept, so you need to keep it for a period of 5 years, and you need to record within that agreement how many hours the worker or employee has worked and has been furloughed. So it needs to set out what their working pattern, if they are working part-time, what their working pattern is, and then the number of days or hours or weeks that they've been on furlough.
Just had some questions on those points I think you might have just answered. One from Helen Cobb: do we need written acceptance from employee regarding flexible furlough agreements, or just a written record?
Yeah, so you need ideally a written agreement. So it's not just a written record, it's a written agreement. So we would suggest that you, so in your new flexible furlough letter, if you just have a piece at the bottom where the employee has to sign to confirm that they accept the terms, and then obviously you've got their agreement there to the terms, because essentially the furlough arrangements are a change to their employment contracts, a temporary change to their employment contracts, and generally any changes to employment contracts need to be agreed with the employee or the worker. So we would suggest that their agreement is obtained and then kept on file. Obviously, there might be some situations, particularly if you've got a lot of employees that you're wanting to put on flexible furlough, where you don't hear back from them. And our advice generally would be to assume that if they've, and you can even say in the letter that, you know, if you've not replied, we'll assume that you don't agree to it. Just so that it's absolutely clear on what their position is if they haven't actually responded to you by the date that you're intending to actually place them on furlough. Were there any other questions, Laura? Or?
Yeah, just one more question from Lee Wise. Do we need to provide employees with written confirmation of the days we want them to work when bringing them into work from furlough, which I think you have kind of answered in your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, the written agreement that you're putting in place with employees to record the flexible furlough term should record within it how many hours the worker is expected to work if they're coming back on a part-time basis, or the number of days that they're on furlough. So it needs to be really clear in terms of what you're expecting and what you're intending to actually claim under the scheme. So my suggestion would be that all of that is recorded within the written agreement. Okay, so that was a bit of a flexible furlough scheme in a nutshell. So I suppose another question in terms of what your plans are going forward. So, I mean, I've had mixed reactions and responses in relation to the flexible furlough scheme. I think some businesses are intending to use it going forwards, but some aren't. Some are considering other measures, which we'll come on to talk about in a second. But just interested to know really whether you are intending to use the scheme going forwards or not. It is, it is complicated, but it still is that lifeline there, I think, for many businesses and organisations that are only able to operate on a limited basis, or they're still expecting an increased downturn in work. So again, if you've got any comments or anything in respect of that, then please do let us know and pop your comments into the chat feature. So as I said, I'm going to come on to talk about furlough exit plans. So this is a really key topic at the moment, because obviously a lot of sectors and industries are beginning to be able to open up again and to have employees and staff back to work. For some sectors and industries, employers are forced really to think about ways to actually make cost savings. And it's, it's sad, but I think it's inevitable given what's happened, and given that most businesses and sectors have been unable to operate either at all or in the same way that they were doing previously for quite a significant period of time. So some of the things that we're being asked about is in some sectors returning to business as normal, so just ending the furlough arrangements and bringing employees back to work on their previous terms and conditions. So if you have had employees on furlough and you're wanting to bring them back to work, you generally just need to write to them to inform them and to cancel the furlough arrangement, and then inform them of the date that they're expected back in work. There's no sort of strict requirements about what notice you need to give to them, but we'd suggest that you give them as much notice as possible, just because obviously it's a big change to what they've been used to for the last couple of weeks or months, potentially, if they've been on furlough for a significant period of time. So obviously, if you can return to business as normal, that's great. But as I said before, we're getting quite a few queries and questions at the moment about other measures and what else that you can consider. So we've been asked frequently about ways to reduce payroll costs, ways to make cost-saving measures, and there's some examples of things that you can consider on the slide there. So obviously we've already talked about the furlough scheme and extending furlough either on the same terms as before or on revised terms using the flexible furlough scheme. Ending the furlough period and bringing employees back on reduced hours or reduced pay. And again, if you're wanting to change somebody's hours or change their pay, then that ideally should be agreed with them in writing. And then ending furlough and bringing employees back on reduced pay, but the same hours. And obviously that's not going to be an attractive option for employees. And again, it's something that you would need to negotiate with them and agree in writing. And those are going to be really difficult conversations and should really be considered as a last resort if you've got other options that are available to you. And there's another piece as well, I think, in relation to returning to work and coming back to work, around making sure that it's safe. And Laura is going to consider that in a little bit more detail in a second. We've also got there on the slide offering unpaid leave or sabbaticals, perhaps considering whether employees would be willing to reduce their hours. There's quite a few different things that you can consider, but most of it you do need to get the agreement of your workers too. So it's really from a HR perspective, I think a communication piece, explaining why it is that the business needs to make cost-saving measures, explaining what options that you've considered, and really trying to work with your staff to enable the business to continue effectively. Obviously, there are some situations where redundancies are unfortunately inevitable. It may be that you considered all of the alternative options and there just isn't anything else that you can consider. And in that case, you may need to make redundancies to reduce headcount. In most cases, you will need to carry out a redundancy consultation process. So one thing that employers are considering carefully at the moment is the time limits for that and the time scales for actually starting that consultation process. If you've got 20 or more employees, then you may need to collectively consult with them. And if you've got 20 or more, you need to consult with them for 30 days. And if you've got more than 100 that you're proposing to make redundant, you need to consult with them for 45 days. So obviously that timetable needs to be built into your future planning going forwards. And I suppose the other thing to mention about collective consultation is that if you haven't already got employee representatives or trade union representatives, you may also need to build in a period of time to actually elect employee representatives before you can commence the consultation process, as you need to elect those to have somebody to consult with on a collective basis. And if you're looking at a redundancy situation where you've got fewer than 20 staff, there aren't the same time limits there in respect to the consultation process, but you do still need to make sure that you have consultation meetings with employees, that you discuss alternatives with them, and that you've considered any suggestions, put the proposals to them and given them a chance to comment on them, and that you've carefully considered any alternative options. As redundancy should really be the last resort. There are some other options that may be available. So in sectors like the manufacturing sector or construction sectors, there are sometimes clauses within contracts that allow you to place employees on short time working or to lay them off temporarily. So that might be an option if you've got that provision within your contracts of employment. Otherwise, as I said before, it's going to be a consultation process with staff to try and bring about any changes that you're wanting to make to their terms and conditions. So it's a really difficult situation to be in for most employers. Obviously nobody wants to be in a situation where they're having to make redundancies. But I think my suggestion would be to try and work with your staff as far as possible to avoid that. I've had situations with clients recently where before they know they need to make cost saving measures, but before they actually announce redundancies and go through that process, they've just asked their staff whether they would be willing to consider any other changes to their employment or whether they've got any suggestions to try and avoid it. And they've been able to bring about the cost-saving measures that they've needed to make by consulting with staff, reducing hours, and making changes like that where they've been able to do so. So that would be my suggestion. Have we got any other questions, Laura, just before I move on to the next slide?
Yes, we just had two come in. So one's in relation to ending furlough. So how do we have to be sending out end of furlough letters, or is it just a best practice?
Oh, sorry, Laura, you seem to have got cut off at the end there. Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. do we have to be sending out end of furlough letters, or is it just best practice?
I would suggest that you do, because most letters actually put in employees on furlough would usually have said in them that the furlough period will continue until it's cancelled by the employer, or until the scheme itself actually ends. So I think from an employer's perspective, having a letter and actually writing to them to cancel the period and actually putting that in writing would be preferable, because otherwise there could be an argument that the furlough period is not ended. So I would suggest that you do record that in a letter and actually send it to the employees, just so that it's clear as to what the situation is, and that they're expected back at work. I mean, it doesn't need to be, you don't need to go into sort of reams and reams of detail in a letter. It just needs to say that the furlough period's cancelled. And then you might want to just reassure perhaps employees that you believe it is safe to return to work, and if you have put any measures in place to keep them safe, what those measures are perhaps. And like I said, you just need to say that the furlough period is cancelled, and then explain what date that you're expecting them to go back to work.
There was just a question about the consultation requirements as well. So is the consultation based on location, i.e. if we are doing more than 20 but spread across different sites, so no one site is more than 20, do we have to do it by the time limits?
That's a complicated question, and it's not something that I'd be able to answer without knowing more detail about the situation, because there are provisions within the legislation and some case law surrounding when collective consultation is triggered, and it depends on how many employees you are proposing to make redundant within a period of 90 days that are at what we call one establishment. So we would need to consider whether the different locations could together be considered as one establishment, or whether they are separate. And that's something we'd need to consider in a bit further detail. So it really depends on the circumstances. So I'd suggest that you take some further advice on that, just so that you can be clear about whether collective consultation is effectively triggered or not, as that will obviously then dictate whether you need to consult for the period of 30 or 45 days, or whether you can work to a shorter timetable.
There was just one last question. If we're not expecting employees to do any work, do we need to issue a new letter for the new scheme, or will the original letter be okay? I assume this is that they're not wanting to make use of the flexible furlough.
Yeah, I think it depends what you said in the original furlough letter, because most furlough letters that I've seen, and certainly the one that we use, would say in it that the contribution from the government is 80%. I mean, I suppose it doesn't make much difference to the employee, because they're still going to get the same pay in their pocket. But I think, probably given the announcements that have been made regarding the scheme from the government and that have been in the media, it might be helpful to just send an update to the employee and just let them know that the scheme is changing, but that they're going to stay on furlough on the same basis as before. I don't think you necessarily need to send them, a full letter setting out, reiterating all of the detailed terms that would have been contained in the initial furlough letter. But my view is that it's helpful to keep staff updated on changes to the scheme. So it might be worth sending them a letter just to confirm that they're going to stay on furlough on the same basis as before, with the exception that what you can actually claim as the employer as the grant from the government will reduce, and that you will be contributing to the cost of furlough as the scheme continues.
I think that's all the questions that we have in regard to furlough. So I'll start discussing returning to work. I think some of you might have seen that there has been a few changes. So Boris has recently announced a few changes to the guidance. So I think from the 1st of August, he said that the guidance will look to change. So at the moment, it's that employers should take all reasonable steps to help employees work from home. So from the 1st of August, he said that the guidance will change to encourage staff to return to work. So there's obviously quite a few different opinions on this, and it would be quite interesting if you want to add in the chat function your comments and your views on this kind of update on the guidance. But I think in likelihood, I think despite this guidance, it's probably going to be quite a slow transition for people looking to return to work, specifically on a more permanent basis. Obviously, before they do look to return and before offices are looking to reopen, we're just going to discuss a little bit about risk assessments and what steps need to be taken before doing so. So as employers, you do have to take all reasonable steps to ensure that staff work in a safe environment. So this would include identifying any risks and ensuring you're taking those steps to ensure those risks are at the lowest level possible. So in terms of the COVID-19 risk assessment, this must be carried out before looking to reopen the office. The Health and Safety Executive Guidance have a lot of information on their website about what you can look to include in this risk assessment line, the things that you must include. So we've put those on the slides there. Identify what work activity or situations might cause transmission of the virus. Think about who could be at risk. Decide how likely it is that someone could be exposed and act to remove the activity or situation, or if this isn't possible, look to control the risk. So each of those steps that are in pink on the slides, they need to be carefully considered. They also need to be documented as well. So the HSE website does provide documents that you can use for those risk assessments, so templates that can be used as kind of a baseline to carry out those risk assessments. Make sure that you're also following any recommendations if you're in a specific sector. That's all on the gov.uk website and the specific approved trade or sector websites as well. In terms of the basic rule, it's if you can maintain social distancing, you should do so. If that's not possible, you should only look to reopen if you can put in place any necessary arrangements to ensure the control of the risk of transmission. So, for example, if you're in a kind of an open office space, that might include putting barriers up in shared spaces, maybe creating shift patterns to ensure the same people are working at the same time to avoid that risk of transmitting. Also, quite often people use shared spaces. So there's a few different companies in one space. It's worth ensuring that you're speaking to other tenants and the landlord to ensure you're all taking the necessary steps to minimise the risk. Once the assessment itself is complete, you should publish it on your website. That's only a requirement if you employ more than 50 people. Sorry, so if you employ fewer than 50 people, you wouldn't have to require to put that on your website. In terms of consultation as well, it's just something to note that if you do recognise a union and you've agreed to collectively consult a union health and safety representative, you must look to discuss these requirements as well. So any proposals that you're looking to take to make the workplace safer. If you don't recognise a union, there's no representative, you would look to consult with the employees directly, or if there has been an elected health and safety representative, you would look to discuss that with them. In terms of what that would involve, it's just giving them information about what things you've taken into consideration, what steps you're looking to take to minimise risks, and also take into account any concerns they raise or any queries that they have as well. Do allow time to consider any queries or any concerns and ensure that you're providing them with informed responses as well to any of those concerns as well. Just it is important to note as well, if you don't comply with those regulations or if you don't have evidence of the consultation, potentially you could be committing an offence, and health and safety inspectors could potentially enforce those regulations as well. So just make sure that you are recording any consultation as well, so you've got evidence that you have carried that out. So I'll now look to discuss the test and trace. I think people might become a bit more aware of this now. If you're venturing out to pubs and restaurants, you've probably seen that they're kind of taking down details of anyone that's been there, so they've got that record. Basically, anyone that develops symptoms of coronavirus must get tested, and you would have to self-isolate for 7 days. Where the test is negative, obviously you'd look to just return to to work after that 7-day isolation. If it is positive, there is now the NHS Test and Trace team. They'll look to get in touch via different methods and to find out who you've been in close contact with. So in terms of close contact, that would mean people you've spent 15 minutes or more with a distance of direct contact with, such as members of your household or family, or people you've had face-to-face conversations with at a distance of less than 1 metre. So contact must have taken place between 2 days before and up to 7 days after symptoms appeared. So the success of the system, unfortunately, depends on how quickly you can obtain a test and get those results. So people that are notified via this Test and Trace app, they'll be told to self-isolate for 14 days. It would just be themselves, member of their families wouldn't have to do so as well. But potentially, obviously, this could mean a number of employees may have to look to call in sick if they are under this, been contacted through this Test and Trace system. So it's worth ensuring that you've got contingency plans in place to consider this. Under the statutory sick payment regulations as well, they've been amended, so anyone that is asked to self-isolate under the Test and Trace system will be entitled to statutory sick pay. Obviously, if they can continue to work from home, if that's what is in place, or if you had allowed them to work from home during this period, then they would look to just be entitled to their full pay as normal. Due to this Test and Trace policy, we would recommend that you have a look at the policies that you already have in place in terms of coronavirus, just to ensure this is considered within the policy. So in that box on the slide, you'll see that we've kind of recommended just to ensure that it is clear to staff, to tell them if they have been asked via this Test and Trace app to self-isolate, that they should tell you as soon as possible, and that they should also comply with the request as well. If you're allowing them to work from home, if that's possible for that period, just so that's clear within the policy. And where that's not possible, just making sure it's clear to them what you'll be looking to pay them, if it's statutory sick pay, contractual sick pay, or full pay, dependent obviously on their contract and what's been agreed as well. We would just recommend that that's clear within the policy itself. So it might be worth having a look at the policies you have in place and making sure these things are considered as well. So I'll also now go on to discuss shielding and vulnerable people. So as I've mentioned, obviously, it seems that the regulations are changing quite a lot at the moment in terms of what's been announced recently. Those that were considered critically extremely vulnerable and those that are shielding. So that considers most people with, if they've got kind of rare diseases or any respiratory diseases. There's a full list on the gov.uk website that includes exactly who would fall within those categories. Previously, they've been advised not to leave their home, but now it's kind of changing slightly. So they are allowed to leave the house, meet new people, do some exercise outdoors. This is going to change further on the 1st of August. So they will then also be allowed to return to work from the 1st of August as well. Obviously, it's worth ensuring that you're aware of anyone that could potentially fall within this category. They're obviously going to be very wary of looking to return to work. So it's making sure that you do listen to any concerns that they do have, to kind of consider that as well. Also, in terms of, we've kind of discussed in relation to risk assessments as well. Those that are considered within the category of extremely vulnerable, they're likely to also fall within the category of disabled under the Equality Act, obviously dependent on the condition that they have, but it's quite likely if they do fall within that category. That means that if you are asking people to return to work, potentially those within this category could be put at a disadvantage just because they're at higher risk of, in terms of exposure, a higher level of risk to that compared to others that aren't within this group. So it's worth just taking that into consideration, particularly for the risk assessments itself. We would recommend that you carry out any individual risk assessments on those that fall within these categories. It's worth also kind of taking into consideration what, in terms of the individual risk assessment itself, what steps can be taken if they are looking to return to work. For example, if they're in a kind of face-to-face role, for example, busy reception, whether with their agreement they may want to change that role into more of an admin role where they're not face-to-face with people as much. These are the kind of matters that you might look to consider in terms of the individual risk assessments itself. The only other thing as well to raise is obviously from the 1st of August, if they are able to return to work, they wouldn't fall under the statutory sick pay anymore because they are able to work. They're no longer deemed incapable. So from the 1st of August, they would no longer be eligible for that statutory sick pay. So that's something else worth just considering in terms of that. So I think the main thing as well, there's also in relation to people from certain BAME backgrounds could potentially be at a higher risk as well. So it's worth ensuring that any risk assessments that you do have also include potential risk factors and identify any steps that you need to take considering that as well. So I think I've kind of sped through a few different things. So obviously do feel free to raise any questions. We'll have a look at the chat function then. But that kind of brings us an end of the main content of the presentation. I think we've raised a few kind of factors as well that we'd be quite interested to hear any comments that you do have as well. So we'll go to any kind of questions that you may have and we'll go through those now. We will also be sending out a feedback link just at the end. That would be really helpful when we do get that out as well. But we'll just have a look at the chat function now, or feel free to unmute if you want to raise any comments or have any specific questions.
There is a question, Laura, in respect of what you were just talking about. We've got somebody that's has somebody that's been shielding, and that period ends on the 1st of August, as you've said. They, however, don't want to come back to work. And so the question is, can we cancel the furlough period, or essentially what are the options around that? So they're saying that they wouldn't force him back to work, but are they okay to put him on unpaid leave, for example? It looks like the employer's put in place some site and safety measures as well.
Yes, I think it's kind of the main thing is discussing it with them, what concerns they have. Specifically about returning. Obviously, it's quite understandable that they're going to be wary, and if they really don't want to return to the office, it's worth saying that obviously you would carry out an individual risk assessment, and if you yourself view it as too high a risk for them to return, obviously you would be wanting to consider these other options anyway. So obviously the options are in terms of furlough if the scheme is still available at that time. Potentially if it is possible to, with their agreement, carry out a role that would put them less at risk, that would allow them to work from home, or potentially other options in terms of looking to have any unpaid leave and things like that. Those are the things that you'd look to need to consider. But I think the main thing is having the conversation with them in terms of what you're looking to do to make the place safe and what options are available and what would suit them best. It's worth considering those options.
I think just to add to that, I think one of the key things that we need to think about is that there is this protection within the law in respect of employees that might reasonably raise concerns about safety because they think that there's as it says on the slide there, a serious and imminent threat to their health. They are, if that is a reasonable belief, they are protected by the law from being put to a detriment because of that, and it can lead to whistleblowing. So if they've raised these concerns with you, it can lead to whistleblowing claims. So it's just important to make sure that you as the employer has done everything that you can do to make the workplace safe for them and make it what we're calling COVID secure. So as Laura said, it's this risk assessment process and making sure that you've done everything possible to make it a safe place for them. And then my view is that it's a communication piece. So really, working with the employee to try and reassure them about the measures that you've put in place and what you've done, doing everything that you can do to try and explain to them why you believe it to be safe. Showing them the risk assessment, perhaps showing them all the measures that you put in place, and if either you or they still feel that it's unsafe, then as you've pointed out in your question, considering these measures that you could consider, whether that's furlough, if you don't think it's appropriate to put them on furlough because there is work for them to do, and you are confident that you've explored this issue about safety, then do you want to consider some form of unpaid leave? But I would suggest that that be a last resort after you've gone through this investigation and communication process with them, as there are obviously some risks in taking that course of action when there are things like furlough and other options available. I don't think there's any more questions in the chat function, but obviously if you do think of a question, or if there is something that comes up after the event, then please do feel free to get in touch with us, as we'd be happy to answer those and to pick up with you further. And we will be in touch with all of you that have joined today, and if you have asked a specific question, then again we'll pick that up with you further. I think otherwise, the only thing left to say is thanks very much for joining us this morning. Thank you again to Page Personnel, who we have ran this session in partnership with. We do have a coronavirus hub on our website at irwinmitchell.com, and it's got loads and loads and loads of information there that you will probably find helpful, not just in relation to employment law, but in relation to all aspects of the law and how coronavirus has impacted on those areas. So you can see on the slide there some snapshots of the pages. So please do visit that if you need any further information. And again, you've got the employment law pages there, and you can see all of the different topics that are covered on the hub. If you've got any feedback, questions, or if you want to suggest some topics for us to cover at future events, then please do feel free to send those through to our events team. The email address there is on the slide. And as Laura said previously, one of my colleagues has included the link to the feedback form within the chat function. So please do take a few minutes just to fill that out for us, either now or after the event. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.